Hello everybody, my name is Christian Swenson and I make videos here on YouTube about autism, autistic consciousness, and life on the autism spectrum. You've heard of Donna Williams if you've watched my channel. She's a great writer with autism from the 90s and 2000s. She died recently. Her YouTube channel is still up. You can see it. It's rather sad. She's brilliant. She's absolutely brilliant. Suffered from rather more severe autism than I did, but she was able to fight through it, able to find a way above the things that were clamping her down and imprisoning her within herself, and to dare communication with a world that terrified her. She wrote a book about this clamping, this feeling of being imprisoned in yourself, the feeling of being punished by yourself if you dare communication, dare connection. She calls that book, and she calls the clamping it's about, exposure anxiety. Now, the thing about exposure anxiety, which is very common on the autism spectrum, is that it makes it very hard to talk about exposure anxiety. In fact, it makes it hard to talk about anything in here, anything authentic, anything related to feeling, connection, communion, contact, communication, all of those things. And yet Donna Williams persisted. She got through it. She got out. And she describes how she got out. Now, the book's written in a complicated way. She's obviously dueling with this inner jailer, so she has to do it in lots of complicated ways. It makes it kind of difficult to read. So I took the liberty of translating it. I made it easier to understand, more poetic, more fluid, and I'm going to read the introduction to you. So without further ado, here's Donna Williams talking about her inner jailer and how she escaped from her. Exposure anxiety is a survival mechanism. It's a force that jumps in as a substitute parent to protect the self from what it sees as an invasion. Sometimes it becomes self-perpetuating, and it gains momentum over time like a boulder rushing down a hill. Chronic, unconscious, acute exposure anxiety is an addiction to your own adrenaline. Exposure anxiety is both heaven and hell, the lure of the sanctuary and the suffocation of the prison. It's the buzz junkie who both lusts after the high of his own excitement and protects himself against conversation, touch, or love. It's normal shyness turned up to 11. Nevertheless, it's also paradoxical. Those with this survival mechanism can be frozen or manic, despairing or creative, obsessive or indifferent, helpful or aloof, passive or controlling, bombastic or phobic, empathic or violent, open or private, honest or secretive. However, they're all compulsive and they're all terrified. The examples I will give come from my own life, that is Donna Williams' life. They're not exhaustive. Take them as illustrations. Exposure anxiety makes it difficult to survive in a world built on the felt sense of self in relationship to other. Many parts of society rely on making you notice that you've noticed, and we call this communication, interaction, or sharing. Exposure anxiety sees this second-order awareness, this self-awareness, as an invasion. As such, it discourages the impulse to ask for help. It can soften a scream to a mutter. Under its thumb, a capable person needs prompting to do even the simplest thing for himself. Someone creative becomes inactive, someone affectionate becomes indifferent, and someone gentle becomes someone provocative and retaliatory. It's like an invasion switch, and it can be triggered from inside just as well as from outside. In extreme cases, a too strong sense of self-awareness, the jolt of thought, can trigger it. The self, like the world, becomes a threat. It makes us hide from ourselves. It makes us scared of ourselves. It makes us hide from the world. It makes us scared of the world. You feel your own existence too close up, too in your own face. You involuntarily avoid being aware of your own expression. You shun responsibility for it. You can't act on the feelings that could connect you to others, even if you desperately want to. Like agoraphobia, the more you side with yourself against the condition, the more the condition clamps down. Like a Chinese finger trap, attempts to escape control tighten the control. You identify yourself more and more with your anxiety. You begin to think that you're the prison and not the prisoner. You don't dare initiate speaking, don't dare look, don't dare express a need, a want, or a feeling. Don't dare share an interest. Don't dare be aware that you have an interest. You end up with islands of expression where you are completely incapacitated, where you can't do for yourself, can't do as yourself, can't do by yourself. They are off limits. You can remain capable in other spheres of life, but exposure anxiety is insatiable and will eat your life piece by piece until it runs more of your life than you do. You long for connection, but find it terrifying. You are lonely even around many people. You've learned that involvement comes at a price. No one sees who you are inside the prison. No one sees that there is a prison. They only see responses you can't control. There's no greater loneliness. Exposure anxiety teaches the self that even though it longs for connection, for contact, for love, this longing is futile. Exposure anxiety doesn't just happen for those on the autism spectrum. Some of us are more stressed than others. Some of us are more independent than others, more controlling than others, more passionate, more fixated, more jumpy, more aloof than others, and our personalities come this way. However, many of us with exposure anxiety also have the metabolic, digestive, or immune system problems that also present themselves with autism. A feedback loop takes place. The stress of exposure anxiety worsens these physiological problems, and those physiological problems worsen the stress. That stress affects information processing and throws neurotransmitters out of balance. It makes those who suffer from it feel overwhelmed by the outside world. The stress of exposure anxiety magnifies the sensory volume of eye contact, of touch, of any face-to-face, self-to-self contact to extremes. The victim hides behind defenses, and others around her don't understand that she's hiding and don't see behind the masks. Therefore, because it is at root a hormonal issue, and because we all experience fluctuations in our hormonal and biochemical states in response to high-stress situations, it affects all of us. Puberty is a good example, but not the only one. In puberty, we feel far too self-conscious and long to pull away, to divert attention and retaliate as if we would die otherwise. The difference is degree and frequency, and the degree and frequency of exposure anxiety attacks affect everything. The worse it is, the more it affects how we appear, how we experience the world, how we experience ourselves, how we grow as people. Our personality, our language, our behavior, and our social skills only grow despite the prison, and never because of it. Even some people without autism have exposure anxiety, and they adapt to it by relying on alcohol or drugs, on props, or even living through someone else. Some are persistent clowns, some are workaholics, and some clinically detached intellectuals who won't and can't let anyone in. Someone with exposure anxiety, therefore, is like a rainbow hidden behind heavy stone walls. In some places, however, the stone is cracked. In some places, the rainbow shines into the world. Someone with exposure anxiety is like a prisoner in an invisible prison. Replica selves, distortions of the self, prevent the real self from getting out. Someone with exposure anxiety is the social person inside trying to come outside. He's the one with the manic face trying to distract you so you don't see his pain. Don't come inside. She's the one with the plastic smile, with the perfect movements, with her learned handshake, with her gut full of despair. These are victims of a world that values the appear at the expense of the self. These are suicides without corpses. For those of us with autism, we can avoid eye contact and can avoid speaking for our own needs because our senses are overloaded. We struggle to move from a state of in front of or at to with. And this is part of a one-track state, a mono state that has to do with our ability to process information. However, These reactions also arise from exposure anxiety. We can punish ourselves for breaking its inner laws, for daring to transgress its limits. If we dare to participate in the outer world, we risk payback from the control exposure anxiety exerts on us. Exposure anxiety is one face of the autistic condition, and yet it is tied up with other factors in complicated ways. It expresses itself on physical, environmental, and interpersonal levels. Personality plays a part. It can vary wildly depending on personal circumstances. Answers, therefore, need to be tailored to the person. Work with it will involve attention to the language of their behavior, yes, but also to the cracks in their defenses, places where the soft, radiant, expressive self shines through. The parent or the therapist should be imaginative, eccentric, and surreal. She shouldn't give in to emotional blackmail or domination. She should be challenging but respectful. She should be bold even in the face of what she doesn't understand. She should be humble enough to say, "Teach me." I, and this is Donna Williams speaking, didn't notice my first experiences with exposure anxiety. I couldn't tell apart what I was and what I wasn't. I bit myself and pulled my hair and tensed my stomach muscles. I'd cough compulsively against the pressure until I vomited blood. Still, none of this was me. I buzzed without any feeling of boundary. I lost myself in the play of light or the wrestle of sound. I indulged in a twitch which then flooded through me as blind rage. I would laugh over a strange shape until I couldn't breathe. I didn't distinguish this from myself. There were moments between these states, but they were few. My I, therefore, was the manic, was the panic, was the overwhelming mix of pain, joy, terror, and rage that was my world. 6 times a day I'd hysterically scream, and these fits shattered any coherence the environment or my senses had. There was no meaning and no memory. The world itself was an enemy. It couldn't save me, couldn't help me. I hadn't yet learned that this flooding was a manifestation of exposure anxiety. Nevertheless, I was social. I was social with dirt, social with trees, social with grass and birds. The rolls of the carpet at the hardware store were my friends. So were the tinkling of pins and the books of wallpaper samples and the lickable surface of patent leather. I felt the world, deeply and passionately. This world, my world, brought me joy. Anything that wouldn't confront me, that let me just be, fascinated me. People didn't fit the criteria. They wanted words like together and us. They were not the worlds unto themselves that I was. I needed to account for them, to interact with them, face to face, eye to eye, in that everyday confrontation we call normal. These invitations were invasions. When the world expected me to respond, I averted, diverted, and retaliated. I stopped existing. I found strategies to tune out my awareness of other or self, and in this way I found some freedom again, but the world didn't take the hint. It watched me too closely, and everything in me seized up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't make myself go to the toilet. Eating in front of others was doing a solo performance in the Albert Hall. Showing the need for the toilet was bearing your soul before a crowd. I would chatter to myself, sing or make sounds to close out the invasion. Others telling me to shut up made my longing to drown them out larger. If someone expected me to reply, though, I shut up. I hated hearing my own voice. It felt like fingernails on a blackboard. It wasn't the noise. It was the adrenaline. Everything was too much. The pain was the pain of having so much self in front of so much other. I was allergic to the experience of my own existence. When I wasn't shouting to close out the world, I felt betrayed by my voice. It was a sellout, a traitor, a participant in a world that attacked me on all sides. I became indifferent to life. I compulsively disowned myself. To speak with my own voice and my own feelings physically hurt the muscles in my throat. It was easier to use someone else's voice, to use TV commercials, stored lines, to wait to be told to go to the toilet, to starve and grab food when others weren't looking. Even though exposure anxiety uses its defenses, diversions, and retaliations verbally, I have hardly ever heard myself as myself. My strongest expression has always been through typed words. Going without is always easier than asking or waiting for an answer. Giving in to exposure anxiety always feels like relief. Panic subsides. The reward of refusing to care is so strong that it becomes hard to think of any other way to be. It structured my life and my mind so much that even when I address the underlying information processing problems, the world of self in relation to other remains difficult to imagine or understand. My private world became a prison of its own. I was caught between the desire to join the world and the desire to keep it out. I was being controlled by overwhelming survival impulses. The brutality of exposure anxiety was like an abusive parent, but no one could see the prison I was in. No one could see that I was in a prison. They had never experienced the hell of exposure anxiety. Their theories took no account of it. They couldn't help, and they often hurt. Fighting against exposure anxiety made it worse. From its perspective, I allied myself with a dangerous environment against it. I became something like a foreign body, a pathogen, fighting against what was for my own good. This was never worse than at age 9, again for Donna Williams. I learned that I could interpret the world, that the world had meaning, and exposure anxiety clamped down with a force it had never shown before. This time was also when years of chronic stress led to juvenile arthritis, an autoimmune inflammatory response where the body attacks itself. I like to think that the stress exacerbated poor processing, that poor processing resulted in overload, that the overload triggered exposure anxiety, and that the exposure anxiety reinforced the poor health in a vicious feedback loop. At its absolute worst, this struggle made me unaware that I had any thoughts at all. I sat 8 hours looking at a spot on the wall until told to move. I was meaning deaf and meaning blind. I saw and heard but couldn't interpret, couldn't understand. I starved myself for days. I shirked away from any connection. I punished myself for any attempt to get out. I peed all over my room as a desperate attempt to rebel against myself. I felt like an island. I have felt murderous against the world during those times. It taught me to make a smiling facade, to make a pretty glass coffin. I have hated the world and longed to join it at the same time. I have hated the world and hated that I hate the world at the same time. I know what it's like to be buried alive, to give up completely, to find it painful to keep believing. Happiness only happened when neither I nor anyone else noticed too much. I was free then, in a waking dream, yes, but free. I learned that mine would have to be an unknown knowing, trusting that I could be intelligent even if my intelligence would surprise me. I have learned that I could tune out when I needed to, not all the time, but to give myself at least a chance to know the world as others do. I learned to laugh at my exposure anxiety, at my aversions, diversions, and retaliations. I got playful with it. I negotiated with it. I learned how to calm myself. I mastered maneuvers in my mind which could shift perception and prevent me from identifying with it. I have learned to celebrate the buzz junkie, but not let it run my life. We share 50-50, and we each tolerate the interruption from the other. I have survived its other half, the self-murderer within, and asked for help when I didn't know how to help myself. In the gaps between release and re-imprisonment, in that day release, I have learned how to make sure that what I need and want won't be thrown away. I have learned to expose exposure anxiety, to trigger its own compulsion as a way to disown itself, to set me free. My exposure anxiety is extreme, but it is an exaggeration of a pattern that affects all of us at one time or another. So, if I can get out, you can too. That's it, everybody. I hope you found that helpful. You can escape. The world is welcoming. Take care, everybody. I'll be back soon.